I don't think that we need to read the entire thing, word for word, and and I think that there are certain aspects of it that can be sort of dealt with somewhat readily, and then other pieces that will take a bit more time to really unpack. I have been sort of reminded, looking at it in some detail over the last couple of days, just what a really a sort of a, for lack of a better term, sort of a classic of world literature it is. I mean, it's just a remarkable piece of poetry, and very quite radical in its take on the wisdom tradition, and it sort of has really underscored for me the degree to which the Bible, as in as much as it hangs together as a unitary text, really is about providing a kaleidoscopic kind of view of the way people approach human life. That our lives, we can't get through our lives with sort of a single attitude or a single philosophy, right? That we need to constantly sort of engage with disparate ways of understanding what's going on around us. And so there are times, perhaps, when the sort of what appears to be the kind of biblical consensus, right, that your behavior determines your fate, right? That if you behave, if you follow God's rules, then God will treat you well. If you do everything you're expected to do, then everything will be fine, right?
Do you believe that?
No, I mean,
because I started to look before I had a little time, and Satan comes onto this.
Yeah, we'll get to that, Sandy. It's a very interesting piece of it, right? But someone has just joined us. Who's joined us?
That's Phyllis.
Oh, hello, Phyllis. Great.
Hello.
Wonderful. Let me just going to put your name there, so that everyone knows that you're Phyllis and not a random collection of numbers. So Sandy, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the whole point is, first of all, relating to my life, my views have changed. I've grown from my experience.
There you go. Right?
I remember my grandmother, who was a big influence, and I was 7 when she died, was very religious. Okay. I went through various growing up. I was in college, freshman calculus, and Dr. Goldman said he didn't believe in God.
Whoa.
I was surprised that he didn't fall dead on the spot.
And also that a calculus teacher would feel that it was, necessary for him to express his opinion about theology. That's awesome.
At Brandeis, everybody spoke about what.
Oh, right, that was Brandeis. Of course, they're all Jewish. They have to have an opinion about things.
No, they weren't all Jewish. We had some non-Jewish football players.
Oh, okay, right.
Right, and don't forget basketball.
Right. But in response to your question, Phyllis, I think, do I believe that if you follow God's rules, that everything will turn out fine? I would have to say that my answer to that is that it depends on what you're talking about, right? And that on the whole, I do have a sense, right, that without sort of claiming that the rules that the Bible outlines are the rules that really matter. But what I would say, right, is that I do have a sense that people's behavior matters, right? That what you do, a person's actions in the world do have an effect on the world, right? They don't always have the effect that we expect. They don't. Things don't always obviously turn out the way that we want them to. But that, in fact, if we say as a culture insist upon burning fossil fuels and refuse to look at alternatives, right? The likelihood is that environmental degradation will continue apace, right? And so in a certain sense, there is a way in which people reap what they sow. On the other hand, right, I think there are other times, other situations where a person's behavior and the outcome of a particular situation are not necessarily aligned in any causal way. And so that I think in order to get to make sense of the world, you need to have, on one hand, the flexibility, right, to recognize that sometimes there is no clear cause and effect, and that bad things happen because bad things happen. And yeah, go ahead, David.
I have a question. Has anybody read Rabbi Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People?
Sure.
Yeah, I
He
have.
uses a lot of the book of Job in it.
Yes. Right. Absolutely.
He has an interesting comment on all of that. He says what he basically says, and maybe I shouldn't say what.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, it just seems that he says that the world is chaotic and now I'm a calf's got my tongue. It's so clear to me what he says, and I can't put it into words, but he says that God doesn't wish evil on us. And when bad things happen, it's not because of God punishing us for something. It's what happens in the world.
Right.
And our whole relationship with God is on some completely different level from that.
Right. Right. Exactly. And I mean, hold on 1 second, David. There's someone else who's joined us. I just want to make sure I know who is at 9246.
It's Elijah.
Hello, Elijah. Who is it? Okay. I can't hear you. Whoever's at 9246, I'm thrilled that you're here. And if you can tell us who you are, that's great. Otherwise, just happy to have you with us. So, David, you're pointing at something that is in fact very important. The sort of shorthand way that I understand Kushner, right, and this has to do with and this gets to the question of theodicy. Right, the question of human suffering, and is God responsible, or in what way is God responsible for human suffering? Right, Harold Kushner would make a somewhat controversial, makes a fairly controversial claim, right, that God cannot be all powerful and all good, right, at the same time. Right? If God is all powerful, then God cannot be all good. And if God is all good, right, then God cannot be all powerful. I have Christian colleagues who are very uncomfortable. Probably there are Jewish people, who are very uncomfortable with that, that sort of, what would they call it? Sort of I forget exactly what the word is. It's sort of like a modified theism or something like this. Which is basically says that God is with you at all times, but God is not all powerful, right? God is not in a position to, decide who gets cancer and who does not, or who, I mean, we saw Jimmy Carter, got immunotherapy and it worked, and someone else got immunotherapy and it didn't work, right? And God's not really in charge of that, right? That would be sort of Kushner's take on it. Phyllis, you have something?
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever read Robert Frost's poem. It's a poetic drama about Job.
No, I haven't.
It's really interesting. It's called A Mask of Reason.
Okay, that
And
sounds great.
It's worth looking at.
Yeah. And then there's also, JB, right, by Archibald MacLeish. I mean, Job obviously, Job obviously is a sort of a one of the reasons why we sort of can say, oh, it's a classic of world literature, right, is the degree to which it has inspired countless spin-offs and revisions and reworkings.
It's such a conundrum. I mean,
Right. It sort of, and I think that this is one of the reasons, when Robert Alter suggests that one of the reasons that it became part of the canon of the Bible, right, even though it really stands in contrast, right, to the rest, to so much of the Bible, right, so much of the Bible is this sort of doctrinaire, behave and everything will be great, right, sort of attitude, that sort of the reality of the reality of the world, right, demands an acknowledgement that is not always the case, right, and that that there's a need to engage that reality, and that the Book of Job allows us to do that in a fairly profound and productive way. Now, so who is at 9246? Now I'm hearing stuff from you. Huh. Okay. I'm going to put you on mute so that we don't have background noise from you. And I will go into my phone and see if I actually have your phone number, in case I can figure out who you are. Let's see here. One of these days, I'm gonna memorize everyone's phone number. Once we had cell phones. No, okay, I don't have yours. Once we had cell phones, I was able to then forget numbers because they were just in the cell phone. Now that we have Zoom, I'm being asked to remember numbers again. Okay, so let's back up from these heady topics, because we can we sort of can get into this conundrum, right? So let me give you a little bit of a background on the book of Job as I, in the research that I've done over the last couple of days. I'll just give you sort of a little bit of a background on it. And I just want to say before we start that in some ways it's a little bit odd that we're looking at the book of Job today. And I have to thank David for suggesting it, because it was David's idea. And the reason that it's odd is because the book of Job is one of the things that we are allowed to study, in the Jewish tradition at least, on Tisha B'Av. Right? Tisha B'Av is the saddest day of the year. It's the commemoration of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and and the Jewish tradition has sort of assigned a number of other historical catastrophes to Tisha B'Av. And so we are not supposed to study Torah on Tisha B'Av, but we are allowed to study the book of Job because it is such a sad day. Now, today is the 5th day of the month of Adar, the Jewish month of Adar, and the tradition suggests this Hebrew phrase, which I learned early on in my journey to even before I was in rabbinical school, that Misha Nichnas Adar Marbim Basimcha. So when Adar begins, right, or when Adar comes in, we should we increase our happiness, right? Our joy increases. It's not entirely clear to what degree we need to manufacture that joy, or that the joy just happens. Hello, Gail. So when Adar starts, we should get happy, right? We should be thrilled. So, presumably the last thing we should study, right, is the book of Job, right, in the month of Adar, right? So, I was thinking about how delicious this juxtaposition, because it really, I think, matches sort of where at least I personally am, and I sort of sense that it's not just me, that this is kind of where we are, right, as a culture, as a community, on almost the yard site of the year anniversary of the first lockdown, right? It was right after Purim. I remember we had Purim. I believe Purim last year was on a Wednesday, and on the Sunday for brunch, I was able to bring in two students from Harvard Hillel. They came, I think, just to Dinesh. They came to the brunch at Dinesh and visited with residents. And some of the residents were like, "Why are you bringing people from the outside?" And I said, "You're right. I think this is going to be the last time we do this." And indeed, like the next day, like on that Monday, we said, "Okay, no more anything," right? And so it's been this year, right, of illness, of plague, of way too many deaths. And so I think, there is this, we are sort of holding these two, we're holding these two realities, right? That we are entering the time of the holidays, the time of joy, right? For Christians, this is, we're beginning, today is Ash Wednesday, right? Today we really begin the Easter season, right? We're moving towards Easter. And so it's this time and it's this time of great hopefulness, right? Where in our community, at least, we've all received the vaccines, or at least we had the opportunity. If we weren't able to for some reason, that's a different story, right? But the vast majority of people have received the vaccines, and so we are looking, we're looking forward now to whatever the next thing is. We don't know what that is, and we don't know when that is, but we're at least looking forward to it. So I feel like at some level, right, we are in this weird, highest of highs and lowest of lows kind of a place. So Job, trying to make sense of that, really, I think is in a sense a good idea. So, so the book of Job. So the book of Job, we really don't know. As is often the case, we don't know anything about who wrote it. We don't know with any specificity about when it was written, right? According to Alter, it likely is later than earlier because of the lexicon. There's a lot of words that come from the Aramaic, so it points to the idea that it was written at a time when Hebrew was giving way to Aramaic as the lingua franca of Jews. So it's almost definitely post-exilic, right? But it's sort of, he claims that it's sort of the poetry of the highest caliber, right? Even a higher caliber than most other biblical poetry. And that that the profundity of the topic is matched by the profundity of the poetry. Because it's so difficult, it has had a very difficult textual history, and so there are many problems with the text. There are several interpolations. There are several places where it appears that sections are sort of in the wrong order, so on and so forth. There seems to be a big section that is just gone and replaced by a section that is that doesn't really match the rest of it. And so I think as we read these things, we may, as I said, we probably don't need to read every single chapter, all 42 of the chapters. But I do think it's really interesting to point out that it has this very complicated textual history, but that it and also that there's a fairly big distinction between the frame story, right, the first two chapters and the final chapter, and then what comes in the intervening chapters, right, and that distinction is not least of all the fact that the first two and the last chapter are in prose, and the rest of the book is in poetry. All right. And that frame story really appears to be a folk tale, and that the name Job shows up elsewhere in the Bible, and so it appears that this guy Job, at least as understood in the first two chapters and the last chapter, is the guy that had everything, was blameless, lost everything because of this sort of because God is being hold on one second, because God is being capricious, and then gains everything back, right? That story is sort of a well-known story, and that that story was probably reworked to become this frame story, and then the intermediate stuff, of course, is much more complicated, much more subtle, and much more sophisticated. All right. So I think what we'll do today, any questions about that? Or comments? Go ahead, Naomi.
Well, it's like Job loses everything. There is a poem which I tried to find yesterday from the viewpoint of one of Job's daughters, who is innocently sitting there having lunch at her brother's house when suddenly all of them are killed.
Right.
And she's a little upset about this.
Right.
When you talk about Job losing everything, there are also some interesting commentaries about his wife, which I'll yell about later.
Yes. I was only the other day did I learn that later tradition.
His wives. Sorry.
Oh, right. The later tradition sort of assigns Dinah, of Jacob's daughter Dinah, to be Job's wife, and that the rabbinic tradition sort of complicates and makes much more, shall we say, sympathetic Job's wife than the way that she's portrayed in the first two chapters of the book. So yeah, there's that whole sort of post-textual history as well. So yeah, and right. I mean, and as is the case in many fairy tales, right? There's this very tight focus on the hero, without a lot of thought given to the collateral damage, right, and to the collaterally damaged, so to speak. What about? I mean, not only the daughters, right, but also the seven sons and the three daughters are just summarily dispatched, and then they're summarily replaced, as though that is in any way a real consolation. Hello, Yefim, and hello, Florence. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Great, Phyllis, go ahead.
Yeah. How is the name Job spelled in Hebrew?
A yud, a vav, and a vav, and a vet, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. But I'll have to double check that. But I'll put it up on the screen and we'll have a look. All right. So what I thought we could do today is we could look at the first two chapters, and see what we think. Just to sort of start with it, and see, sort of get a sense of these first two chapters, right? Because that is just the frame story, and the frame story is important, right? Just because it's sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Just because it doesn't have the sophistication and the complexity of the subsequent pieces, I think it's important, to understand it, and B, also to sort of recognize that the Job of chapter 1 and chapter 2, right, is has a very long and respectable and important function in the way that the tradition suggests that we address the reality of loss in our lives, right? There is no question, right, that we as humans will experience loss throughout our lives, right? And Job, Job in the book, in the first two chapters, is provides a model for the way that a model for how to address the reality of loss. All right, so I'll just sort of read through this. And I was wrong, Phyllis. I want to apologize. Eov has an aleph at the beginning.
Oh.
Okay, so aleph, yud, vav, vet.
Wow. Okay.
Okay. All right. So there was a man in the land of Uz, or in Hebrew, it's actually Utz. Utz, like the Z in Mozart. Utz, whose name was Job, and that man was wholehearted and upright, and one that feared God and shunned evil. Now, just to sort of let you know, I'm going to use this translation, the old JPS. And if people have other translations in front of them, either New JPS or Alter, and you have questions, please feel free just to shout them out. And because I think I think it's worth engaging with the various varieties of translations in any case regarding the Bible, but certainly in regards to the book of Job, because it's the Hebrew is so difficult. So just notice these three things, right? That he was Tam, right? He was and Yashar Virei Elohim. So wholehearted is how they translate it, upright, and fearing God. Alter says that Tam is not necessarily wholehearted, but blameless, right? That he didn't do anything wrong, right? And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters, right? And people will point out that comes to 10, right? And these sort of round numbers, right, are important to the sort of numerology of the story, and again, sort of place it in the realm of fairy tale. No one really knows what the land of Utz is, right? People want to make this into sort of a there's a sort of idea that Job belongs to the time of the patriarchs, but he's not Jewish, right? He's not an Israelite, and I think that's very important to point out. And I guess the question will be, well, why is it important to point out that he's not an Israelite? And if he's not an Israelite, and the story doesn't care about the Israelites as a nation, what is it doing in the Bible, right? So I'm just going to stop the share here for a minute, because I do think that's a really important point. What do we make of that Job is not an Israelite?
The first I knew. I never thought about it.
Yeah. Phyllis, go ahead.
What is he doing worshiping the Israelite God then?
Well, that's what's really interesting, right? It's not entirely clear, right, that he actually is worshiping the Israelite God.
Oh.
Right? He's worshiping God. He's worshiping Elohim, right? So the name of God that we have in other parts of the Bible, the Yud He Vav He, right? That God, there. I mean, it's assumed, obviously, right, that is the God that is being worshipped, right? But people in this book don't know that God by that name, right?
Not only that, it's the plural.
Well, right, Elohim is a plural word, right? Which can mean judges. It can mean holy beings, right? But it is generally understood to mean. It is generally understood to mean to mean God in the singular, right?
But the fact that they don't use the singular name is interesting.
Right, they don't use Yud He, but Yud He Vav He is said Adonai, which is also a plural form. So it's the plurality, the unity of the plurality, I guess you'd say. But yes, so let's think for a minute about why is it important that Job is not an Israelite.
Does that rationalize what happens?
That's an interesting thought, Naomi. Say more about what you mean.
I'm not sure what I mean. But if he's not Jewish and all of these terrible things happen to him, and possibly if you are Jewish and you're upright and all the rest of it, maybe terrible things won't happen. I'm not sure, but it
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I mean, I see where you're going with this, and I don't want to say that you're wrong, but I actually think that but anyway, but before I comment, let's see if there's other people have thoughts about it. David, do you have a thought about this?
Well, I was wondering, how do we know again that he's not an Israelite? What is the source for that? Where does it say that?
It's not so much that it says that; it's about what it doesn't say, right? Alter points out that here it says Ish Haya, right? And that this connects that if it were a more typical biblical story, it would be Vayahi Ish, right? So Ish Haya makes it sound like the story that the prophet Nathan tells to King David when he says, "Oh, there were two men in this land, right? One rich guy and one poor guy." If you've read the book of Samuel, you'll remember this story, right? And this is after David has Uriah killed and takes Bathsheba, right? And Nathan tells him this sort of folktale to make him realize his sin, right? So this is in sort of folkland, right? It's not in a sort of a recognizable Israelite historical setting where it otherwise might be.
Like a folk tale event, but
Say it again, David. I'm sorry.
the whole book like a folk tale in some sense.
Well, actually, that's what's interesting is that the first two chapters and the last chapter, right, fall into this sort of fairy tale mode, right? That there's this guy, God decides to play, sort of to make a bet about this guy, right? And the Satan, right? We'll get to Hasatan in a minute, but Hasatan decides that whether because Hasatan is jealous or just because we have a sort of a creaky plot point, right? They decide to have a wager. Let's see what Job does, right? And Job, turns out not to curse God, right? And so God wins the bet, and God then restores Job gives Job back everything that he had lost. Right? So that sort of fairy tale frame, right? Is in fairy tale land. There once was a king, sort of a thing, right? As opposed to a recognizable, Israelite-ish kind of background. So in a little sense, it's a little bit more about what it doesn't say than what it does say, if that makes sense, David. Yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
But it's God treating Satan as an equal?
Well, first, okay, so we'll as I said, we'll get to Hasatan. The one thing I'll say, right, is the one thing I'll say right now, right, is it is the Satan. It is not Satan, right, as later tradition would sort of come to give Hasatan a name, Satan, it is now. At this point, it's Hasatan, which is translated various ways. Alter translates it as adversary. New JPS translates it as adversary. Let's see. And right, so this old JPS following King David, I'm sorry, not King, the King James Bible translates it as Satan. So I do think that a fair amount of misunderstanding of the book of Job stems from this translation as Satan, because the idea of Satan as, sort of, say, Milton would have him, right? Is later than the book of Job, right? There's no idea of Satan as a separate entity, right? Hasatan is just one of God's retinue, right? We might even sort of say one of the aspects of God in this concept, right?
Well, who tempts?
I'm sorry?
Who tempts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden?
Well, the snake.
It's a snake. It's not Hasatan at
No.
all.
No.
Well, then,
Yeah, I mean, maybe in rabbinic sources, I don't recall. Maybe in rabbinic sources, but yes, no. The sort of equation, right, of the equation as the equation of the snake with Satan, right, is a later development, right? That both, again, I'm not an expert on this, but my guess is that the Jews, as much as the Christians, probably play with that idea, right? But but there is no real there's no real independent Satan in the Jewish tradition. It would always be sort of one of God's, the adversary, right? The Hasatan is generally seen as sort of the prosecutor, right, in rabbinic literature, the one who is arguing for the strict application of justice, right, which is clearly not what's going on here, right? Here Hasatan seems to have more of a let's see what kind of chaos we can wreak and see if we can make Job, sort of curse God, which he then doesn't do, right? So you can sort of see how Hasatan here develops. It could easily be seen. It could easily be taken as the later idea of Satan, but that is a later idea, so we don't want to go too far with that. If that makes sense.
but in the King James, it's Satan.
Satan.
In the King James.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And actually, in quite a few of them, I think, in most of them, it's Satan. And I don't know, actually, it would be interesting. I haven't looked at more recent Christian Bibles, so I don't know if that, excuse me, I don't know if that change has been made in more recent Christian Bibles as well. It's a really interesting question. But so I think, and this is not obviously original with me, but I agree with the scholarly take that what is important about Job not being an Israelite, right, is that the story then is universal, right? And it's really about everybody, right? And so this is again sort of, in counterpoint to what you were saying, Naomi, right? That it's actually not saying, right, that if he were Jewish and he followed the rules, there wouldn't be any problem, right? It's saying basically that this is a universal issue, right? That suffering, and unwarranted suffering, right, is a phenomenon that affects all peoples, right? And and this is one of those places where, and this is again where I was saying before, where the Bible is very much unwilling to prescribe a single story for anything, right? And I think that's one of the reasons, among the reasons why the Bible remains it retains, shall we say, such relevance, right, over the course of history, right, is because it's not a univocal text in any way, right, and so yes, the much of the Torah is a very particular book, right? Very focused on the Israelites, right? Very focused on the history of what became the Jewish people, right? And these are stories that later Christian commentators would use to talk about their own communities, right? But that there are many places in the Bible that are fully universal, right? That are talking about the world as a whole, and the book of Job is one of those places. All right, so let's continue. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. Notice we have 10 again, right? 500 yoke of oxen and 500 she-asses. So there's, another 10, right? And a very great household, right? If I understand correctly, actually, I'm sorry, I realize I should be sharing this so you can follow along, right? And a very great, so it's avudah, rabba me'od, right? A great number of servants or slaves, depending on your translation, right? And he was the greatest of the children of the East, right? So there's sort of like, again, there's a sort of fairy tale kind of a thing. Oh, he was over there way back when, sort of like in a universe far away, in a time long ago, like the Star Wars make themselves into fairy tales that way. And his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one upon his day. And they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And so it was, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up in the morning early, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and blasphemed God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually, right? So there's this very big fear, right, of God forbid we curse God, right? And just to point out that this word here, the word that is used for the word that is translated as cursing God, right, is actually verhu, right, that they bless them, right, so that they bless God. So there is a regular use of euphemisms, right? Because we don't ever want to write in Hebrew, curse God, right? Because then, God forbid, we actually might, right? So, and so there's this motif, right, of cursing God is something that Job is already worried about. Right? All right, so now we switch gears. Hold on. we switch gears. Oh, sorry, ignore my little purple, please. We switch gears and we say it fell upon a day that the sons of God, right, B'nai HaElohim. So this basically means, right, the cosmic retinue, right? There's different ways of talking about this, right? God is known as Adonai Tzevaot, right? The Lord of hosts, right? So this is just one way of saying. Sometimes it's the stars, sometimes it's the angels, right? So whatever this happens to be, right? This is the retinue of God has gathered, right? They came to present themselves before. I was wrong. It actually does use this word Adonai. Okay, so this is they come before Adonai, right? And Satan also came among them. But okay, so what is this? Gam hasatan betocham. So as I said before, right, the more appropriate probably translation is the adversary, right, or the prosecution witness, right? And God says unto Hasatan, from the adversary, whence thou comest, right? Where have you been? What are you doing, right? And the adversary answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it. Who knows? Maybe looking for people who are doing the wrong thing, right? Looking for people who are sinning, looking for an excuse to punish people. And this, and again, I'm probably going to be guilty of anachronism here, right? But in later Jewish sources, right, especially in Kabbalah, right, there is this idea of that God has various aspects, right, and that on one hand there's God's mercy, right, rachamim, right, and on the other hand there's God's justice, right, or strict justice, which is seen as din, right, and Hasatan is identified with din, with strict justice, right. So the idea that any time that anyone does anything wrong, right, that person should be punished. And so, we are always, of course, calling on God's mercy, right, to overcome God's strict justice. But of course, that's a little bit complicated, right? Because endless mercy is not necessarily any more conducive to life than endless strict justice, right? There has to be a balance. All right, and the Lord said unto the adversary, "Hast thou considered my servant Job?" Right. So this is so interesting, right? This sort of notion that God is going to sit here and brag, right? That there is none like him in the earth, a wholehearted and an upright man, one that fears God and shuns evil, right? So God's characterization of Job is exactly the same as the narrators in that first verse, right? And very interesting, right? Whom do we say about there is none like him? Ein kamohu, right? We say that about God, right? So very interesting that God's self here is talking about a human in that way. And the adversary answered God, or answered the Lord, right, and said, does Job fear God for naught? Right? Right? There's no reason for God. There's no reason for Job to fear God, right? Hast thou not made a hedge about him, right? And about his house and about all that he has on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions are increased in the land, right? There's no reason for him, right, to be anything but good because you've been so good to him, right? What would happen, right, he would say, but put forth thy hand now and touch all that he has. Surely he will blaspheme thee to your face, right? Certainly he will. And again, actually, my purple is in perfect position, right? Certainly he will bless you, right, to your face. So again, this is a euphemism. He means that God will, that Job will curse you. And the Lord said unto the adversary, Behold, all that he has is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thy hand. So the adversary went forth from the presence of the Lord, and it fell on the day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, that there came a messenger unto Job, right? And then we have over the course of these next 4 verses or 5 verses, right, that we have the complete destruction of all that Job owns, and then finally the destruction of all of Job's children. The oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans made a raid and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I am only escaped alone to tell thee.
That's the last line of Moby Dick.
Yes. Yes, it is, Naomi. Right. You're absolutely right. And so, in a sense, right, there's, there is, the degree to which Moby Dick is a, sort of a play on the book of Job is also really interesting, right? Because Ahab, of course, is not the patient Job, right? Ahab is the impatient Job, right? He's the one that, lashes out, right? Yeah. But no, I mean, obviously Melville knew his Bible extremely, extremely well. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, A fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them. And only I am escaped, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So this is going to happen. This refrain is going to happen again and again. Right? While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, The Chaldeans set themselves in 3 bands and fell upon the camels, and have taken them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, and again, this is Ad zeh midaber, while that one, right, while this guy, right, was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from across the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Right? And what does Job do? And Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped. And he said, Vayomer arom yatzati mi beten imi, va'arom ashuv shama. Adonai natan v'Adonai lakach, yehi shem Adonai mivorach. Right, these words come out very, very easily on my lips because I say them at every funeral. Right, not the first part of the verse, but the second half. Right, so he says, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. Right, so at birth and at death, I am naked. That is just the way of the world, right? And so who am I to complain about being naked in any kind of premature way, right? And the Lord gives, and the Lord takes away, right? Blessed be the name of the Lord. B'chol zot lo chata Iyov, v'lo natan tifla le'Elohim, right? For all this Job sinned not, nor ascribed aught unseemly unto God. Right? So this is sort of, in our tradition, this is sort of this is one of the ways that is sort of the accepted, sort of approach, right, to approaching loss, that we acknowledge, right, that what we had came from God, and that we don't understand, right, we don't get entirely the workings of the world, and so God is to be blessed and not cursed. It's all very nice, right? Maybe there's some comfort in it. Maybe there's not, right? It depends on where, you happen to be at the time of that loss. So reactions to this first chapter, we'll get to the second chapter in 2 weeks. Next week we'll be learning about Purim, so we'll be, hilarious next week and then serious again the week later. But thoughts and reflections on this. And Yefim, если вы хотите по-русски, я могу стараться переводить для других.
Нет, не надо.
Okay, спасибо. I just said that if Yefim wanted to say something in Russian, I would be happy to do my best to translate it, and he said that's okay. So thoughts on this part of the story?
Well, it sets a scene.
Yeah, I mean that's basically what it is, right? And the second part of the story, the second chapter, is more scene setting. So we will look at that and hopefully it won't take us that long without the introductory sort of stuff to say next week, and we'll get to the third chapter and the fourth chapter, which really complicate things tremendously. So any final before we close? The floor is open. Naomi, you look like you have something to say, but it's just not coming out.
Well, yeah, I guess his wife has to stay alive to become a character later on.
Yeah.
He loses everything basically except the woman he's married to.
Right. And what's interesting, right, is what we'll see in the next chapter, right, is that the adversary will come back to God and God will be gloating essentially, right? And this is a whole other sort of question that I don't have an answer for, which is like, what kind of God does this, right? It's kind of like there's the answer of like, okay, why is there suffering in the world, right? But Job's suffering is of another level, right? It's suffering so that God can prove a point, right? It's in a sense sort of useless suffering. It does nothing, right? Except to prove that so that God can sort of make a point against the Satan, right? So it's ethically it really raises a lot of issues about what kind of God would do this, and I think what's important about that, right, is that Job in the poetic parts of the book, right, will bring that question right to the fore, right? So, all right.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So we'll continue in 2 weeks, and we'll get deeper into this.
Very good.
All right.